I would like to start today. Oh, that's Michael.
Yeah, I'm here, Stanley. So I brought, by the way, the Invisible Committee for you. I
Did
brought
you?
the mimeograph. Yeah, if you could save it for me, I
Good,
can make you
yeah.
one. This is the
Thank you.
whole book.
I-
Right?
Is that the one called Now?
You're gonna read now. Yeah, yeah.
I have
this is-
an amendment to what you may have heard me say. I don't think I said the invisible
That's yours.
committee, but I will. For next week, unless I'm mistaken, I suggest not consciousness, reification of the consciousness of the proletariat. That may or may not be adequate at this point. Adequation is always a relative term. I would suggest what is Orthodox Marxism for next week, because this is his clearest statement of what he thinks Marxism as a whole is, and by inference what socialism is about. Okay. Today we were reading the last chapter of History and Class Consciousness on Towards a Methodology. What made you, Beth, think that you were a complete disaster as far as the reading is concerned? Well, that's what you said.
Such unconsciousness in these matters is quite definitely a sign of the immaturity of the movement.
What did you find difficult?
I'm sorry,
Seriously.
it's in the text.
Yeah, what he said.
What he said.
I did a lot of underlining and highlighting. So there were parts of it that it's like individual sentences made sense to me, but I wasn't able to put it together.
Oh, that is pretty serious.
Well,
No,
Never said otherwise.
That's why I thought
like here's a
that what
here's
is
a
Orthodox
sentence.
Marxism might be the next step.
On page 321, he says, bottom of the page, this affinity can ultimately be traced back to a similar view of the duality of existence and consciousness, viz. to the failure to comprehend their unity as a dialectical process, as the process of history. I mean, I think I understand that sentence, but it's a matter of relating it back to the whole of what he's saying about the party, which
This is still in part one, right?
it's in the
Part
methodology.
four.
No, it's
Part
in part
four.
two, I think.
Part 4.
No.
I mean, he says that the party mediates between the realm of theory and the masses.
Yeah. You may disagree with it, but do you understand it?
I don't think I fundamentally understand it. It's exactly what everyone says who's in a party.
Everyone says I'm in the Socialist Workers' Party, the Communist Party, whatever, because
I know, I understand the mass
I have to mediate between
No.
theory and the masses, right?
No, not that.
And what does the mass line mean?
I think that probably in the case of people who are in micro parties, it means that they are
Micro parties?
small
He
parties.
uses the word minority.
No, I'm not, I mean
Oh,
these
okay.
days. I mean, I think that it probably means more that they see themselves as a vanguard. People who are, I'm talking now current day.
That may be true, but that doesn't cover the whole of what mediation signifies. And as a matter of fact, most of those who call themselves a vanguard misunderstand Marx profoundly, you know. Marx says, I know, that's what I'm here for, to help fill in some holes. I'm just a hole filler. Marx says, we do not separate ourselves from the proletariat. We consider we communists consider ourselves part of the proletariat, not above the proletariat. But as a part of the proletariat, Lukács is arguing that the party has a role, and one of its roles is to help explain the phenomena of everyday life as well as of politics, which are confusing. And the reason that it's a mediation is that we do not expect, except for a very small group of what were called advanced workers, wherever they are. We do not expect that even most workers who call themselves socialists or call themselves revolutionaries would be able to read much of Marx, or for that matter, Lukács himself. The mediation is partly could be understood as forms of popularization, but it also could mean mediation what we're doing here. Pedagogy. We are the pedagogues. The pedagogues are people who can translate or even explain in ordinary language what is contained sometimes obscure words or difficult words. He himself, of course, has been accused of being a theoretician, but not even a mediator. Now, that would have to explain one very important fact. I use the word fact here advisedly because positivism is a fact-based theory, and that's not true of historical materialism or Marxism. And that fact is that when Lukács was forced out of Hungary after he was the cultural commissar in 1919, he went to Vienna, which was a liberal democratic city in the liberal democratic state of Austria. He went to Vienna to be an agent of the Communist International, responsible for those countries in Middle Europe who were not part of the vanguard of capitalism, which was England at that time, Germany and the United States and France. So he became an international party organizer, and stayed as a party organizer until 1929, when he went to the Soviet Union to become a literary critic. My theory of the reason that he did that, made that decision, was that he was never a orthodox, in the word that they use it at that point, the proto-Stalinist party, an orthodox proto-Stalinist Marxist. He never was. He was a Leninist in a way. This is a Leninist, in some ways profoundly a Leninist document, especially his discussion of the role of the party. But he thought that revolutionary communism, or even socialism, he uses both terms in different places, was a mediator. But that revolutionary theory was not a mediator in itself. Revolutionary theory was to explain the next step forward, as all good communists should be, in his view. That contrasts sharply with the position that is taken by a person called Walter Benjamin, who thinks that the revolutionary is someone who redeems the past. You can read in Illuminations, the essay in which he, you should read Illuminations generally, by the way. You should read the essay where he says, Benjamin, Thesis on the Philosophy of History, where he says that the party or whatever, the revolutionary vanguard, it does not look forward, it looks backward, but not backward in a romantic way. It looks to the unfinished tasks of the revolution or the evolution of the political system, and tries to bring them into the present, after which we can talk about the moves forward. So his Jewishness, Benjamin, was that he was looking to the past. Marx said we should, the revolution cannot take its romance from the past. It must always look forward. That was his view. I take that on Michael, don't I take that on in this book?
Yeah, there's some of that on the poetry of the future, yes.
That's right, I
Yeah,
take that
yeah.
on in this book.
Yeah.
I'm not the best bibliophile in my own writing, but I know I wrote
I'm the locator. I'm really the locator.
He's my bibliophile.
He's the index.
The index, yeah.
Index. Yeah.
I'm a bibliophile.
I'm the Wyszynski of your thing.
The what?
The Wyszynski. I'm the index.
The Wyszynski,
Yeah,
my
yeah.
God.
I knew you would.
Wyszynski was.
No, they don't know who Wyszynski is.
Everybody?
Phil knows who Wyszynski was. Yeah.
You know Wyszynski?
Not really. I've heard the name and
The
I.
attorney for the state in the prosecution of the old Bolsheviks, Bukharin, Roddick,
Karl Roddick.
yeah, and others,
He was Stalin's
who
henchman
were
in the
finally
law.
put to death in
And
1938.
Victor Beria was the actual henchman. And two people significant in that
Yeah.
period, Wyszynski and Victor
He
Beria.
was Stalin's juridical face.
Yeah.
Was he an old Bolshevik
Neil Gorsuch.
himself?
No
that
way,
period.
Jose.
Okay.
Was he what?
They were all put
Was he
on
an old
trial.
Bolshevik himself?
No, Wyszynski was not. It's an old Stalinist.
Yeah.
He was a Stalinist, but not an old
Not
Bolshevik.
an old Bolshevik.
There's no indication that I have from reading the history of the Bolshevik Revolution, either the Trotsky history of the Bolshevik Revolution or their own history,
Yeah.
that an Andrei Wyszynski appears as one of their number.
Okay.
He was a lawyer.
Yeah.
I was brought up to believe. Now, I'm not saying that this is something I still hold 100%. I hold it now only.
Was this during the boy Stalinist?
That, you can't trust lawyers. They are
I
really
would second
officers of the
that.
First we kill all the lawyers.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that.
That's Willie the Shake.
First we kill Willie the Shake. First we kill all the lawyers.
Right, first we kill all the lawyers, right. Then take on the deviant medical doctors, I guess.
I'm there.
Those who practice clinical
That was another case of
psychoanalysis.
Stalin's, the Jewish doctor's case.
What?
That was another case of Stalin's, the Jewish doctors, right?
Yeah.
Later and after the show trials.
The Jewish doctors, yes.
What was that?
What?
What was that about?
It was an anti-Semitic. Let's get something clear. This is not to be taken figuratively, we could take it literally. If you took a survey of the old Bolsheviks, that is to say, the wing of the party, of the Social Democratic Party, that was called the majority, the Bolsheviks, you would find an inordinate number of Jews. One of them was Leon Trotsky.
Some people say that actually Lennon, he wasn't raised Jewish, but
Who?
Lennon,
Yeah,
yeah. But he had Jewish heritage, though.
yes. Well, and, you know, as we Jews would say, anybody of any worth has Jewish
And then it won't then be in May of '68. We're all German Jews.
Danny the Red,
Danny
the
the
heart
Red.
and soul of the Paris uprising of May '68 was Jewish.
Yeah, he's
And
not.
he
he's
became
not
a
a red
parliamentary-
anymore.
He's not- he's not even red.
Not even green. Not even green.
What'd you say?
He's not even green anymore.
He's not red anymore, he's not even,
No, he's a
not
so-
even green, like
No.
Michael said.
No, but you know, everybody has their moment. Some of those moments are retrograde, and I could talk about my own if you wish. There's now a big organization called the Democratic Socialists of America. The Democratic Socialists of America was born in March of 1983 as a result of a merger between a crazy revolutionary socialist organization called the New American Movement and a social democratic movement, a centrist social democratic movement called the Democratic Socialist Organizing Committee. We were pledged mistakenly. I was in the New American Movement. We were pledged not to raise the question of the Democratic Party in the merger, that people had the freedom to become part of the Democratic Party and to run for office or to support Democratic candidates within the Democratic Party. That demand was made by someone called Michael Harrington, who wrote a very big bestseller of 1961, I think, called The Other America. How many people in this room have heard of The Other America? Or read it?
The other.
I've read it.
No, I've heard.
I read parts of it.
Yeah, that
Also,
was
you
Mike
might
Harrington's entrance into the big time. After that, he became a consultant to John F. Kennedy, and he went on to become a consultant to Lyndon Baines Johnson.
And the Anti-Poverty Program.
And the Anti-Poverty Program was responsible, indirectly, but certainly it's embedded in The Other America. Well, the point obviously is that was my weak point, because I was elected a negotiator by the New American Movement. I was on the National Committee of the New American Movement, which was smaller than the Democratic Socialist Organizing Committee. We had about 1,500 members, and they claimed 5,000. We took the claim seriously because most of their members were dues payers or attendees at their annual Deb's dinner, Eugene B. Deb's dinner. But they did have a larger membership than we did, and so we let that one go for later on, but it never returned. Now the Democratic Socialist Organizing Committee now is not that open. It's not that the Democratic Socialists of America is not that formation that we made deal with. But it was true that they never had real chapters. When we merged, we brought in all the chapters to DSAA, most of which dissolved because we discovered that the Democratic Socialist people, DSOC, Organizing Committee, were essentially centrist intellectuals, center-left intellectuals. And that wasn't who we were. We were center-right. No, Anyway, no, we were left wing, and they really weren't. They were a wing of the Democratic Party that could be compared to Bernie Sanders. They were New Dealers, and we were not. And so most of the people who had negotiated that deal, like myself, but not just myself, Barbara Ehrenreich was on the committee, and Richard Healy, whose mother was Dorothy Healy, had been the head of the Southern California Communist Party, and she had joined DS. She had joined the New American Movement.
She wasn't,
we all
she
left.
wasn't for it, was she?
What?
I've read somewhere that he was for it, but she wasn't.
Who was she?
Dorothy
Dorothy
Healy.
Hill.
Who was he?
Her son.
Richard was very much for it, and she was mumbling against it, but she wasn't that old, by the way. She never waged a campaign. I was living in Southern California slightly before the merger, when these discussions were on. And I knew where Dorothy stood, and we were very, very good friends at the time. She spent hours and hours with me telling me the history of the Communist Party in the United States and in Southern California, because I interviewed her extensively, and I still have somewhere, they must still be in Southern California, the recorder upon which her statements about the CP were made, because she was arrested as by the FBI. He was one of the essentially 33 communists who were arrested between 1949 and 1950 by the government, federal government, for a major crime, which was called conspiracy to advocate the overthrow of the government by force and violence. And what they did is they went into court and dragged Lennon into court, and Stalin, and so on, to prove that these 33 people were promulgating a revolutionary line, which, of course, in the case of the Communist Party, had not been true since 1935, except when they recruited you. Then you went to, then they had schools, and those schools taught what is to be done, what the Friends of the People are, and how they fight the Socialist Democrats. Friends of the People were an organization, by the way. And then his famous book about Kautsky, which is called The Renegade Kautsky. You read it?
No, we had a guy in school that his last name was Kotsky, and we always used to call him Renegade Kotsky. Much to his distress.
What a drama!
All right.
He became a Spart.
A spy?
A Spart.
Oh.
He joined the Spartacus League.
Was he a son?
I
I don't think so.
don't think so.
There was a guy named Servetius who had the same name as the defender of Eichmann in the Jerusalem trials.
That's
Yeah.
unfortunate.
Very bad time.
But the main guy against Mitch Lennon of philosophy was Ernst Mach, an Avenarist, but mainly Mach, who, of course,
Well, Mark was a physicist.
what?
Mark was a physicist.
And a mathematician, and wrote a book called The Mechanism of Society.
Science
It's
of
here
mechanics.
somewhere.
Yeah.
And in the book is a little section which he wrote in the 1890s called The Theory of Relativity. Einstein read the book and gave that phrase, a mathematical form, not just the phrase, but the content, that that object and subject had no fixed meaning, that their significance depended upon the context within which they functioned, which is the shorthand for the theory of relativity. And now accepted by many biologists and very few physicists and chemists. Physicians and physicists and chemists believe that the latest thing that they've learned is the end of science. That particle is the last step. Particle physics has reigned literally since Heisenberg and Niels Bohr in the 1920s. And they're always looking for the steps below, and they find steps, and then they find those steps to be inadequate. Not that they've discovered a new stage necessarily, but they continue to make mistakes. So if you continue to make mistakes, do not throw out the methodology, throw out the mistaken conclusions, and repeat the methodology in new research. Dialectical thinking tries to invent a new methodology, and that's what that last chapter was indicating. What problem did you have about, you want me to go on?
Yeah.
You just heard it. The dogmatic Marxists, against whom Lukács would argue, and Lefebvre argues, he died in 1991, Henri Lefebvre, and Wilhelm Reich argues, the dogmatic Marxists, who are inspired by Stalin, and I'm going to give you the name of the book that you should look up about. Stalin wrote things, by the way. He was no slouch. He was not only a good tactician, according to Trotsky. Trotsky had enough horseshit to fill a 900-page book, as well as many other things. This is one of his...
We won't mention all of those other things.
No, it's
In
a
the Me
very...
Too
He
era,
wrote a
it's not
history of the
good thing
Russian
to mention.
Revolution, in which Stalin is presented as a tactician who was Lennon's sort of go-getter. And it ignores one major work by somebody called Joseph Stalin, Marxism and the National Question, 1913. Lenin assigned Stalin to write a book or a large statement in which the traditional hostility by the Marxists against nationalism is to be modified and perhaps even reversed. And it was Stalin who wrote the book Marxism and the National Question, in which he said that the struggle for national liberation should be supported by the vanguard, should be supported by the communists. It is a stage in the liberation of the oppressed. It's a stage in the liberation of the colonial people, etc. Now, there's one, there's more than one, but there's one writer whose work is available to anybody who wants to read it on the national question, and that is Rosa Luxemburg. She was implacably opposed to the national question being reversed, that is to say, to the reverse of the traditional view. She said nationalism cannot under any circumstance lead to socialism or communism. there were nationalist revolutions in Algeria. Where else?
Well, all over.
Huh?
All over.
Vietnam.
Yeah, Vietnam, Congo,
Vietnam.
the Congo.
Vietnam, they were nationalists as well as communists. The most
China.
nationalists.
Cuba.
Yeah, where else?
You know, El Salvador, that was a national liberation struggle.
The national liberation struggle in El Salvador. The beginning of the Brazilian left is in a national liberation struggle led by the Brazilian Communist Party under Luis Carlos Prestes, which at one point controlled a third of Brazil and was told by the center in Moscow to come down from the third where they had an armed camp and lay down their arms and join the democratization of Brazil, which never really happened.
And they ended up being captured by the dictatorship.
Yes.
Stanley, if I may, I think this is a
What'd
good
you
time.
say?
If I may,
Page.
in your book, 106,
See, you ask, why did I bring this book? I knew there would be somebody with some question in this book. And if nobody had any questions in this book, I would be deeply disappointed.
and the last two paragraphs, the end of the chapter,
Yeah.
that I
Yeah.
don't particularly want to read out loud myself.
To accomplish these aims, the organization would assemble a small army of intellectuals, not only academics, but also,
I can read it.
go ahead, read it, yeah.
No,
Go
I
ahead.
read it from your book. I don't have it.
I could read it,
Okay.
Go ahead, David. She's got it.
so you can keep your book.
Go ahead.
So to accomplish these aims, the organization would assemble a small army of intellectuals, not only academics, but also journalists, theoretically oriented trade unionists, and others who would engage in the work required by the project of transforming capitalist social formations, including extensive propaganda activities and the sponsorship of schools of popular and advanced political education, and research institutes. A press will be essential for ideological intervention, and the organization would sponsor through financial and organizational support a series of independent left periodicals, especially daily and weekly newspapers and journals, all of which would take advantage of the vast potential audiences offered by the internet. All of the old arrangements are now in disarray. In much of Europe and Latin America, the ideological and political disintegration of the center-left parties has resulted in a revival of a series of left political formations whose relation to the old Russian question has been partially severed. It is time for the left in the United States to make a similar break.
And that's what,
Okay. So what's your question?
well, I brought it up because my question is, what is the old Russian question?
That's very good. The old Russian question was, in part, that when there were two Russian revolutions before the Bolshevik takeover, right? The 1905 Russian Revolution and the February 1917 Russian Revolution. Both of these revolutions, 1905 revolution was, from the Bolshevik point of view, necessary to support, although it could not win. It was certainly crushed, and the Bolsheviks were forced underground. And many of the revolutionaries within that revolution who were nationalists were also forced underground. The 1917 revolution, the February Revolution, was a social democratic and liberal revolution with the Bolsheviks participating, but being very critical. Kerensky, who was the head of that revolution, February of 1917, the face of that revolution, took power, and by the spring of 1917 had not put into effect those reforms that he had promised: free public education, free health care, and so on, nor had he taken steps. Nobody expected that to be initiated in toto. Lenin is by this time in Switzerland. He is actually in exile, and he did not directly participate in the February Revolution because the Tsarist regime had basically excluded him from even citizenship. Lenin perceived that Kerensky was a waste of time, and the Social Democrats were not going to, as they had evolved in Russia, were not going to even initiate major reforms. They were called Mensheviks, and you see the Menshevik mentioned in Lukács, Social Democrats, and essentially the Social Democrat of that period became a figure and a party in Germany, particularly very important, that disdained revolution and believed that liberal democracy was the next step, and that step by step one could achieve socialism, if not by revolution, at least by a series of essential reforms. The ideological leader of that movement was Edward Bernstein, who in 1899 wrote a very influential book called Evolutionary Socialism. And Bernsteinism, or Menshevism in Russia, had totally failed, in Russia anyway, and was on trial in 1917-18, was on trial in Germany. The Social Democrats and the Communists were at odds. And Lenin arrives in the Finland station and declares, Finland station, by the way, is Russia, arrives in the Finland station and declares in the April Theses, Lenin's April Theses, that you had to forget the evolutionary socialists. They were going to submit themselves to liberalism of one kind or another, to market practices and ideology, and said that the proletariat is ready for the revolution, so that the Bolsheviks and their allies, the anarchists, should assume the responsibility of revolutionary action and not wait for the Kerensky types to evolve into socialism. When he arrived in April and enunciated what I just mentioned, the April Theses, virtually the entire Central Committee, the entire core leadership of the Bolshevik party, which is to later on become the Communist Party, thought Lenin needed a clinical psychoanalyst. That Lenin was talking through his hat, that you had to give capitalism a chance to fail. Lenin said, no, it's already failed, because capitalism in Russia began to develop in the 1860s, and evolutionary socialism, which had been a central aspect of the practice of the German social democracy was also a failure, and so in order there has to be in what Engels had talked about, leaps in history. You cannot proceed step by step where that step by step is not warranted, and you have to leap into history and establish the conditions for at least socialism, if not communism. He didn't think communism was on the agenda. At least socialism, had to establish socialism and a broad program of workers' democracy. You had to establish that over the heads of the incrementalists, social democrats, or the friends of the people, or the Narodniks. That's who they were, the friends of the people. And he had to convince the leadership that his position was correct, and he did convince them. So between April and October, the Bolsheviks worked with the anarchists to take the next step in the revolution, which was the revolution on the revolution. It was a second step of the revolution, not of evolution. And in October or November, depending on what calendar you accepted, in October, it was called the October Revolution, but it was November in our calendar. The October Revolution, they took power. The Mensheviks were not outlawed. They were invited to participate in the legislatures, but they were not to take power. They were not taking power. On the other hand, the Bolsheviks began, if not gradually, at least decisively, by the early 1920s, to turn on the anarchists. They fought against an armed struggle. The anarchists had been successful in organizing the peasants and had established peasant organizations which were communist organizations in comparison to the Bolsheviks. A good part of Russia, in the Russian rural areas, and they were wiped out, more or less, except those who consciously joined the Bolsheviks, who kept their views to themselves or agreed to change their views and function inside the new revolution.
Who were the socialist revolutionaries?
What?
The socialist revolutionaries?
Yeah, social revolutionaries.
Social revolutionaries.
Social revolutionaries were essentially revolutionaries who had supported Kerensky,
Okay.
but were not socialist, except evolutionary socialists. But they were not in agreement with the Social Democrats because they were not interested in parliamentary victories. Social Democrats had become, as they have all over the world, parliamentary socialists.
So the woman that tried to assassinate Lennon,
He was an anarchist.
It's an anarchist, yeah.
He was an anarchist.
So what was the Bolshevik beef with the anarchists?
They were not for the state as a transitional form.
Okay.
The Bolsheviks were militantly committed to capturing, not assassinating, not destroying the state. I must say, in 1917, before the revolution, Lenin had written a book which would make your beliefs quite confused. You want to be confused some more? but he wrote it was written not like Lukács. It was called State and Revolution. It was as close to an anarchist, communalist point of view as you could get, and not come out as an anarchist. It was anti-state. It was pro-commune. It was for a broad workers' democratic regime based on association of collectives. You could have said that this could be written with appropriate adjustments to the United States situation by almost any American revolutionary. Now, of course, after the revolution, two things occurred which were very significant. Lennon got shot. It turned out to be, in the long run, a fatal act. He didn't die right away, but he died in 1924 and was in a sick bed for most of the time. Lennon got shot in 1920. And the second thing that happened is, as the Bolsheviks took power, in order to consolidate their regime, they made a deal with the German state and the army, German army, which had defeated the Russian army. One of the reasons for the revolution, the first one, February. They made a deal to cede territory and to make some kind of long-term peace with Germany, which had been regarded by the Russian regime, of the Tsarist Russian regime, as an enemy. It made an enemy into a very tactically adept friend in order to consolidate power. The return, which is that Germany was not going to overturn the regime, was not going to invade the Soviet Union as it was being established. That was the deal, and it was a fateful deal, because in the two decades that followed, there is evidence that what Stalin had failed to do was what had to be done in order to really consolidate a communist country, which was to have an armed population. Just so we get some facts straight. I have not been to Cuba, but I have really good friends who have been to Cuba. Cuba itself, civilian as well as military, is still an armed camp. Citizens still have rifles and other weapons of war. It is an armed population to a large extent. It may be that there's a secret deal between Raúl Castro and the American president and his regime to disarm the people, and maybe that was what went on, because I could understand why the Cubans would agree to that foolishly, but they did to a certain extent.
Well, the Venezuelans are armed as well.
Yes, the Venezuelans have not capitulated at all. You can't defeat, even though you may have superior conventional military equipment, you can't defeat an armed people. You can defeat an armed army, but not an armed people.
Machiavelli, the notion of the popular militia.
Right. That's right.
Yeah, very.
The prince.
The prince.
And what's significant here is that he wrote this not in Russia. He wrote this in Switzerland, and
Wrote what, State
State
of
of
Revolution?
yes, but then declared as he returns to Russia and takes up his position in the Bolshevik regime. In 1918, pilots the declaration by the Bolsheviks that they have now entered into a period of what they call war communism.
The Red Terror.
No, they didn't use the word red terror. More communism. More communism meant that the pursuit of the war,
There was no direct law.
no, the pursuit of the war, whether conventional or unconventional, they certainly were not going to own the whole population because they didn't believe the whole population was pro-Bolshevik. So they were going to pursue the war and suspend radical solutions to forms of rule. Suspend them until the war was over. Of course, they did hold on to the fiction of workers' councils, which was Soviets really mean workers' councils, right? They had the fiction of the workers' councils, which debated all the issues, none of which became policy of the regime, almost none of which, I'm sure there's some of which they did. And they still existed throughout the Stalinist rule of the Soviet Union, but had virtually no power. Ergo, the holding on to the term Soviets. The division of the communists, of the Bolsheviks, of what communism was a system of association, affiliation of collectives with a center whose function was to hold off the foreign armies and foreign influences, and also to coordinate the distribution of the means of livelihood to the broad population, but not to be a dictatorship in the traditional sense. And of course, Lenin himself, who had many faults in my opinion, did not have a Stalinist view of the Soviets. He held that the evolution would be the formation of the Soviets to begin to implement a regime of workers' power contingent upon what he thought was the inevitability of the German Revolution, which would set forth a revolutionary wave which might include almost all of Europe, and certainly would have a tremendous influence, but not power in the United States. The turning point that many historians regard as such was 1923 and 1924, the establishment of an authoritarian Russian state, which held the affiliated states like Ukraine, and my caregiver, who was a Georgian, and Georgia and others, held them as essentially colonies, supplying food to the center as well as to themselves. Yeah. Let me just say one more thing, okay? Beth, one more thing. Now, it should be known which is not very well known. Scholars know it, but not many people who call themselves leftists, that the country from which Stalin himself emerged was Georgia and not Russia. He was Georgian.
Which is why you wrote the nationalist question.
Right, but as Katie
And Rob Banks.
says, my caregiver,
Early on.
oh, Stalin was from West Georgia. I said, Katie, where are you from? Oh, I'm from East Georgia.
No
Where the-
icons
where the
in
good
that
Georgians
household,
live.
family.
What'd you say?
I said, where the good Georgians live.
West Georgians. West Georgians we understand why they are Stalinists, because they were
Midnight train to Georgia. like
authoritarian. And she thinks that the West Georgians now still rule the country under the former director of the KGB. You know who he is, right? You having trouble with that, Josh?
Who is Shevardnadze?
I'll get to that in a minute.
Okay.
Who was the prime minister of Russia?
Yeah, when?
Not prime minister. He's now president again. He was prime minister for a while. His president went to become prime minister, but
Putin.
Medvedev?
Medvedev is the prime minister.
Vladimir.
What's his second name?
Putin.
Putin. And what was his former job? Under the-
KGB.
What was it?
I
He
don't
was
know.
the director of the KGB, which was the CIA of the Soviet Union.
He was the prodigy of Yuri Andropov.
He was the
Who was
prodigy, who was the party leader.
The leader.
That's right. And his prodigy was Putin.
He had a
This
nice
was,
smile
this-
on his face when he went
What'd
to
you
North
say?
Korea. He had a nice smile on his face in that photo at the New York Times on Friday's paper, right? You saw that? I mean, he had, had a kind of like a devious smile.
Who was Shevardnadze? Nobody?
Well, he was he became the first president of an independent Georgia.
Yes. Shevardnadze had been in the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the USSR, but he became a nationalist and went back to Georgia, which was his home, and became the president.
His daughter's on RT now.
She's on the media station, on Putin's station. Your friend Rick Wolf won't sign a contract because he's afraid of, a regular program there might get him, in bad graces.
That's Poland.
And what is the second party after Putin's party in Russia?
The second party?
The second party, the party who ostensibly is always runs for parliament in opposition to
The Communist
Putin's
Party.
party. The Communist Party. The Communist Party lives comfortably within Putin's party,
Right.
within Russia.
We have many files. We have many files.
Yes,
Could I go back to the text?
yes.
You started to say.
This text.
You start to say the dogmatic Marxists that Lukács argued against, ...
Yeah.
inspired by Stalin.
Dogmatic Marxists believe a couple of things. First, that Marxism is a science with invariable laws, just like physics. Let me start by saying something that you may not know. although I know one person in this room who does know it, maybe two. The Soviet scientific establishment greeted the work of Heisenberg and the Einstein inspired physicist community generally greeted that work with tremendous skepticism. Some of them went even so far as to believe that modern physics that came out of the theory of indeterminacy was basically a fiction. And that Newtonian physics and its amendments, absolute time and absolute space, right? That's Newtonian physics. That Newtonian physics and its modern amendments was the real physics, and the other physics of relativity of Einstein and Heisenberg, etc., was fiction. Now remember, the theory of evolution that Einstein proposed, of relativity and of evolutionary relativity, actually, that Einstein and later on the general relativity. I'll get to that in a second. The theory of relativity, everything depends on conditions of time and space. There can be no absolute time and space. Time and space are always in constant motion. That's one of its main elements. That theory was considered by the Orthodox Marxists, or the real Orthodox Marxists, not of the Bolshevik period. This is written hardly a Bolshevik period. Bolsheviks had taken power, but they had not established authoritarian socialism yet. They believe that time and space are orthodox. That if you look at history, history can be understood in terms not only of events but chronology, and that one period of history stands on the shoulders of another experience. The eminent sociologist Robert Merton believed that science was essentially, he was an Orthodox Marxist in some respects, following his Orthodox Marxist teacher, Talcott Parsons. I have a whole. I'm not going to burn you with my theory of Talcott Parsons and Robert Merton, but they essentially believe there is one science. But the signal public statement by Einstein is that theory of relativity, the special theory of relativity, which is a sub-theory of general theory of science, which is Newtonian. So he did not break from Newton until later in the 20s. It was interesting, that 05 is when he has the relativity theory, 1905. He's denied by conventional science of all kinds for 15 years. 1920, there's a meeting in which the theory of relativity is confirmed because they allegedly found empirical evidence for its fruitfulness.
Who did?
The conventional scientists.
Okay.
Well, I mean, there was a solar eclipse.
Oh, right, that was after
Yeah,
that
right.
eclipse that they went.
Yeah.
Especially the British. They were the
Polish mathematician.
gatekeepers
right?
of conventional
The
science.
Polish mathematician.
What'd you say?
There's a Polish mathematician, too.
Who?
I think it was Lubachevsky, there was a famous Polish mathematician who actually fleshed out part of the mathematics, or Einstein used that mathematics to.
Lubachevsky?
Yeah, I'll remember the name correctly.
All right. I learned him with somebody else.
Okay, maybe, no, maybe.
He was Polish.
Polish, yeah.
And they wrote a book together.
Hmm.
Einstein and,
Yeah.
Jesus, why did it escape
Yeah.
me? Anyway, it was not until 1920, 15 years later, that the theory of relativity was agreed to, among its major figures of the agreement was Eddington, Arthur Eddington. And there were others. But when they agreed to the theory of relativity, they had to move on. And here's where there's a second break. The Einsteinians, most of whom moved on to what Heisenberg was to argue. Anybody know what that is?
What, the Heisenberg principle?
What
Principle
is
of
it?
uncertainty.
Yeah.
The
The
uncertainty
act of
principle.
measuring changes that which is being
Niels
measured.
Bohr, who was Heisenberg's teacher, and Heisenberg were committed to carrying forth the Einstein project.
Mm.
And they believed that in order to carry the step forward, that is to say, the theory of relativity as a step forward, that time and space are themselves historical, products of historical change.
Huh.
They believe that.
I'm sorry.
I mean, in what sense are they talking about time and space being products of historical change?
That it was not only that methodologically science made changes, but the large changes in physics particularly were reflected in the large changes of society as well.
Okay.
I've read my Heisenberg book called Physics and Reality, and I read some stuff by Niels Bohr, although not as exhaustively, because his stuff is not as well translated from Danish to English. But that was in some, but the general theory that Einstein enunciated remained for 25 years after 1920, or 30 years actually, until about 1950, 55. It was actually 1950 that it was solidified a general theory that everything, it depends on changes in time and space. So that all the time and space remain. This is where the net to Newton remains. Time and space remain the coordinates of all science, of physics especially. It is the coordinate that explains all science, as well as historical reality. But time and space are coordinates in the relative sense that he spoke about in 1905 as a special theory of physics. And the Soviets continued to deny it until the death of Stalin. I have in my possession, and I have to say, embarrassingly, somewhere, works of Soviet physicists who describe their own evolution to the position of Heisenberg and Niels Bohr, and to make the analogy between dialectics and the new physics. Of course, Einstein himself thought that time and space were always contradictory. To use a much more, not just a popular example, but an example in history and social science, as well as in Einsteinian physics. We don't live in the same world as Heisenberg, as Einstein, and certainly not as Newton. How can we have a social science, a mathematics, a physics, a biology that still owes its premature to Newton? There is a book by two biologists, one of whom I know quite well, who's now no longer with us, that discusses some of this stuff. It's called The Dialectical Biologists. They're both Marxists at that time. The book was written in 1971. Richard Levins and Richard Lewantian write this book. And they're clearly in the camp of Einstein and Niels Bohr and of Heisenberg, but they're trying to put it together in terms of their biology. They're both, by the way, top-of-the-line biologists, both of whom work for in succession MIT and Harvard.
They both worked in Cuba too, right?
I'm sorry?
They both worked in Cuba as well.
They worked in
Especially
Cuba,
Levins.
but they didn't work
Especially
as
Levins,
a
yeah.
appointed full professor.
Yeah.
But they were full professors at Harvard. And one of them was, Levins was a marine biologist. He studied the species that existed in oceans and rivers, etc. I met him, oddly enough, in Puerto Rico. I wrote a history of the Puerto Rican labor movement, believe it or not, which was published in Spanish, not as a whole, it was a pamphlet. It was published in Spanish and English in Puerto Rico, and Levins, who was in Puerto Rico at the time doing research in the marine life of Puerto Rico, had a friend who was a friend of mine. Georg, his name was actually. I lost track of him, and he sought me out, and we had long conversations on the coast of Puerto Rico about the relationship between dialectics and dialectical materialism. And
Well, you were reading a critique of
What did you say?
You read a critique of dialectical reason
I read
in French
Critique of
while you were in Puerto
Dialectical
Rico.
Reason before
Yes.
I wrote
Right,
False Promises.
right. In Puerto Rico, you were reading it, right?
I read the Critique
Yeah.
of Dialectical Reason in 1962. I read it in French.
Right.
By this time, I was proceeding to a large extent from my understanding of Jean-Paul Sartre. They were not such. They were not Jean-Paul Sartre's pupils. They were pupils of Marx and Lenin. But there was enough dialectics in their thinking that they wanted to put it in their own field.
Engels too.
What?
Engels too.
Engels too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now they refer to
Engels wrote a series of notes on dialectics, which is published in English under the title Dialectics of Nature, and spurned by the followers of Lukács.
Lukács has a footnote.
What did you say?
Lukács has a footnote in the first essay.
And the Orthodox Marxism, right?
Yeah.
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 Engels believed that dialectics applied to nature, which had a range of objects, as well as to human relations. Lukács thought the subject-object dialectic was essentially a part of the human sciences, that the dialectical change had to apply to the human sciences. Engels did not believe that, and neither did these guys. These guys were talking about forms of life, at least. They were not trying to talk about physics and chemistry, Leibniz and Lewontin.
And they didn't think that dialectics applied?
Sorry?
And they did not think that dialectics applied?
They did not think that they had the expertise to talk about it. They talked about fish and, and whales and other marine life, which is what marine biology talks about, because biology talks about living things. It does not talk about physics and chemistry. But Engels, of course, did. And his notes are there. And he tried to interpret a range of phenomena, including the marine phenomena, in dialectical terms. When I first read Engels, which was years ago, I was silently in Lukács's camp on that question. I've changed my mind. I don't think Engels is right on every point. I think, however, that the dialectical paradigm has a strong methodological application to living things of all kinds. I mean, physics, as it's understood, precludes life. Engels did not so far as to include inanimate objects in the life sciences, but we have now another mystical movement in the natural sciences that insists that dialectics is truly universal, includes both the forms of life, not just the life of Homo sapiens, but not just primates, the life of monkeys and just chimpanzees, etc., but also all forms of life. That position has not been given a fair shot as relativity theory did get one. Relativity theory got a fair shot because Niels Bohr, who was really part of the inside of science, agreed with it and practiced a version of relativity theory even before it was adopted by the official scientists as scientific law.
Yeah. Supposedly he had kind of a nervous breakdown when he realized that.
Yeah.
Bohr, yeah.
He realized
When you
what?
realize that.
When he realized that that dialectics were operative in physics, in quantum mechanics.
Yes. And you see, even physics has two lines. One of them is quantum mechanics, and the other is the general theory of relativity. Quantum mechanics is still based on the examination of the particle. And Einstein went in the general theory towards a synthetic theory which approached Engels, and not, and I don't believe he approached Engels unconsciously. But he didn't go as far as Engels. But he did make a strong argument that the general theory of relativity was applied to all phenomena. It wasn't a special theory any longer. I'm sure you all know, but if you don't, you'll discover it around this table. He was a founder of a well-known socialist journal in the United States, Monthly Review. He was on the original signatories: Paul Baran, Paul Sweezy, Albert Einstein, and Leo, what the hell is his name? Huberman, who was working at that time for a daily newspaper called PM in New York City. Leo Huberman was a reporter. He was a journalist. And he was known as a very adept popularizer of both social and natural science. Sweezy, who you know from Monthly Review, wrote a comprehensive theory of Marxism in 1942. Why do I say comprehensive? Because unlike the orthodox Marxists who go from Marx to Lenin to Stalin or Trotsky, that's how they go. I've asked Trotskyists who are prominent in one of the other movements, SWP, or those who were in the Shachtmanite movie, who's Heinrich Grossman? They look at me as if I'm talking about Lilies in the Field, which is a good movie, by the way.
Good on pedagogy.
Yeah. Heinrich Grossman is among von Berwick and so on, is among the physicists and philosophers. He was a political economist that Sweezy addresses. And he was criticized for talking about Grossman because Grossman was a certified employee. I use the word employee. He was paid by the Institute for Social Research, which is the real name of the Frankfurt School.
And the only working class member.
Yes.
Right?
There was a biography. Is Grossman's major book
Yeah, just
out in
came,
English?
Haymarket just republished it, yes.
It's out
Haymarket
in
just
English?
put it out. in
What?
English. Yeah, Haymarket.
Just came out?
Haymarket just came out. yeah.
Just came out. I heard about it. But
Haymarket
anyway,
was
Grossman
on
has a
the
biographer, which is a
political
pretty interesting biography, which I also have somewhere here. And other political economists. He also talks about the controversy between von Berwick and the Marxists. The leading Marxists who took on von Berwick's attempted refutation of Marxism, which is, by the way, published, was Bukharin. Before he was in the Soviet Union, his reputation was in the early teens, and it's published in English. Bukharin. Bukharin has two big books published in English. One is on political economy of Marxism, which includes a reputation of bone bear work, and other positivist, idealist philosophers of science. The other is a book called Political Economy of Imperialism, or Empire, I forget. I own that somewhere. It is published in 1915, and it was the model that Lenin acknowledged for imperialism, the highest phase of capitalism. Everything that Lenin has in imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, is in the book on imperialism, Marxism and Political and Imperialism by Bukharin. And I would say that the difference between them is that Bukharin is theoretical and that Lenin is strategic. It's a difference. Lenin is playing the role of mediator, and Bukharin is playing the role of a strategist. I mean, of scientists, I'm sorry. Those are his two major books that are published in English. And he was, Bukharin, not Stalin, was Lenin's darling, and he was the darling of the party. The reason he was the darling of the party before and after the revolution is because he was one of the few members of the top leadership of the party who really had a mass base. He was a popular figure as well as a theorist. He also had a second theory which is not published in English. Of course, it was a theory that he developed during the early years of the Bolshevik regime, which Lenin adopted after opposing it. It was a theory that the new revolutionary Bolshevik regime cannot install from the top communism. It had to let aspects of the market function. And it was adopted by the Soviet Union leadership, including Lenin, who was still alive, as their economic strategy. They would have a larger state sector, but they would have also, from the peasant and from artisans and small manufacturers, they would have a capitalist wing under communist control, but allowed to earn profits. That is to say, not to convert every dime of surplus value into reinvestment into the forces and relations of production, but to allow for a certain portion of the surplus value of private owners to be held by themselves as profit. And that is in practice the first example that we have of a major power engaging in market socialism, and maybe the only real example. The Eastern European communist regimes and the Soviet Union did in fact have a market sector, but they never theorized it. And they had Western investments in state-run industries that the state would distribute to private investors as profit. And that's how they survived the 20s, in part. Private investors, mostly from Britain and Germany, contributed a tremendous amount, not a majority at all, but a tremendous amount of capital into Soviet industry.
So Arm and Hammer one?
I'm sorry?
Arm and Hammer?
You got it.
Yeah.
He can get in the Kremlin faster than any president of the United States.
What'd you say?
He could get into the Kremlin faster than any president
yeah.
of the United States in the 20th century.
Oh, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
His name was Armand Hammer.
Right.
That was his real name. But he converted into a visual, Arm and Hammer,
Right, exactly.
which has the best toothpaste. Still.
Is he the guy who turned people into horses?
No, that's,
You mean in mythology?
well, there's a
Yeah.
movie.
Yeah.
Okay.
No, I got that wrong, right?
Yeah.
Armand Hammer was a second was also an investor. Chrysler was an investor.
Hammer brought drugs. They needed
What did you say?
they needed penicillin in the Soviet Union. That was his first moment. His family were pharmaceutical people before he
Yes.
took over Occidental Petroleum. You know, he set up Gaddafi too. Gave Gaddafi 51%.
And it's no wonder-
of the.
it's no wonder
Yeah.
that the one industry,
Yeah.
it's more than one, but at least one industry, the leading industry that attracts foreign investment in Cuba is the pharmaceutical industry, which is a competitive industry to pharmaceuticals worldwide. Arm and Hammer. He was largely responsible for the development of the pharmaceutical industry because the Cubans under Castro and Che and the others did not have the capital. They had to get it somewhere, and they finally had to get it from the Soviet. What they got from the Soviet Union was very substantial as well. The only foreign investment that has any publicity in the American press, Soviet capital in Cuba, but not American capital or British capital, which there was. Even in the Depression, Hammer decided that he was not going to leave the United States to its own devices entirely as far as his investment was concerned. So he invested in Russia, where he was guaranteed under this totalitarian regime. Some people like to call it authoritarian. It really wasn't. It started out as a coalition government in the early 20s. Coalition government of anarchists and Bolsheviks, and then they turned against the anarchists. So by 1923-24, not only is Lennon dead, but the anarchists have been driven away or into prison. You can't talk to a full-blown anarchist about the achievement of the Soviet Union. Because the achievement of the Soviet Union was only partially investment from abroad, but it was also driving the Soviet workers into virtual wage slavery. 10-hour days were not unusual. 12-hour days were possible in certain industries. Coal miners worked their whole lives in the pits, in the coal pits.
Lennon was a very big admirer of Taylor.
I'm sorry?
Of Taylorization. Lennon.
Oh.
He admired it.
He loved it.
Loved it.
This would be a school for communism.
Right.
Workers would learn
Right.
discipline. They
Discipline.
would have to be
Time, work, and
self-disciplined.
discipline.
Yes, schools for communism. Taylorism. The minute division of labor into repetitive tasks would increase productivity on the one hand, but two, it would bring workers into the discipline necessary to sustain communes. What madness that is, I don't know, but it became the model for Soviet.
And how subversive Ziga Vertov was by making Man with a movie camera
Yeah.
to show a dance and work and, what it maybe could be, right?
Has anybody here besides this one, maybe you, I don't know, seen Man with a Movie Camera by Ziga Vertov? Go to Amazon.
Let's see it.
Major.
I did.
Have you seen it?
Major.
I have this
Did you-
vague memory of
Major.
it.
2 years after Metropolis, after Fritz Lang's Metropolis.
Metropolis, with the great German actor who ruined his career in the United States, Peter Lorre. A very great German actor. And then he played, in some cases, exaggerated cartoon roles.
Yeah, kind of a
US film.
caricature in Casablanca.
Yeah.
Yeah, caricature of his former self. I mean, the
That's one good
performance in
example.
him is unbelievable. Yeah, yeah, it's the child murderer. Yeah.
Who made the Man with the Movie Camera?
Ziga,
Ziga Vertov,
Z-Z-I-G-A.
V-E-R-T-O-V. But it has another charm for film growers. Not the critique that Michael would see, because Michael is a historical materialist, right? not that,
Maybe today.
but the modernist break.
Yeah, the modernist break.
Well, it was an aspect of the modernist break in the Soviet Union, but also in film.
Stanley argues this in a piece,
Where did
social
I argue
text.
this?
Social text.
On
Yeah,
paper?
yeah, on paper, yeah. Yeah, you
Really?
argue this. So when you argued with Annette Michelson.
I'm
when you-
suffering, as you
yeah,
probably have detected, from
You
dementia.
blame, yeah.
I don't have Alzheimer's disease,
Yeah.
but I am demented. In comparison to...
The question is it turned to Pracox yet?
In comparison to my
It's just
mind,
dementia, it's okay.
at the age of 16 years old. I'm demented.
Yeah.
I'm serious.
Yeah, you argued with Annette Michelson. on
Not at
Rollins.
16.
No, not at 16, no.
No,
This
no.
was when you were in
But I
your,
was already
yeah,
demented.
Yeah.
You didn't
right,
have to
right.
be in full possession of your faculties
Right.
to defeat Annette Michelson.
Okay, fair
No, joking aside, I went to this communist school called Jefferson School for Social Sciences, which, however, taught me to read pre-Socratic Plato, pre-Socratic comma, Plato, Aristotle, and the English and German bourgeois philosophers, but particularly Locke, Berkeley, and Hume. Not Leibniz and Hegel. I read the old version, the old translation of Hegel's Phenomenology of the Spirit, which was called Phenomenology of Mind, and remains Phenomenology of Mind basically through the 50s. It only became Spirit, I think, in the mid to late 60s.
Well, the Miller translation didn't come out until the 70s.
The
The
who?
Miller,
Yeah,
the
the
one
Miller,
that's
I mean.
used, the Miller, A.B. Miller's translation didn't come out until the 1970s.
Let's stay with Lukács. What else about Lukács? Confusion or question? I'm going to make a statement. I wonder if you understand it in the text. Lukács was a Marxist mediated by Lenin. This as a whole is a Lenin, I don't mean just a chapter, this as a whole is a Leninist text. I am hesitant until the time after next, after you read what is Orthodox Marxism, to assign reification and the consciousness of the proletariat.
Assign it.
What?
Assign it. We could leave it at that.
George, I'm going to do that, but I want people to read what is
First,
Orthodox
okay.
Marxism first, please.
It's a long week.
Josh has already read it.
Yeah, many of your questions will be answered by that
At least
essay.
on the ground of reification, better too.
It's probably the plainest written essay that he wrote in this book and in this period. But it is a theoretical essay. It's not a mediation. It's a theoretical essay.
Did he call the Marxists post-Lenin vulgar Marxists, or?
Pre-Lenin. Yeah, vulgar Marxism for Lukács begins with the decision by Engels and his encouragement of the German party to become a parliamentary party. And secondly, to relegate the role of the proletariat to an ally of the progressive sections, that's not Engels, the progressive sections of the bourgeoisie and of the peasantry. Vulgar Marxism before Lenin finds in the Soviet Union, finds in Russia, its apex with Georg Plekhanov, 5 volumes of whose works are, some of which are long articles, some of which are books, are included in an essay collection of Georg Plekhanov's writings. Now here's the mediation. One of the things that Plekhanov agreed, he was a Menshevik. He was not a Bernsteinite, but he was a Menshevik. He did not believe in evolutionary socialism. He believed in the Mensheviks believed in stages of industrialization, which was that capitalism will have to develop in Russia to its maturity before the question of socialism can be posed as a mass line. And it's in a number of his books. And it's also in a lot of the work of so-called revolutionary socialists like Karl Kautsky. The renegade Kautsky doesn't come out of nowhere. The renegade Kautsky comes out of his neutrality upon the support given by the German Social Democratic Party to war credits, basically to the war budget of the German government. Now, the French party gave the same imprimatur to the war on its side. So you had Social Democrats declaring that the Germans were beasts and in France, and you had Social Democrats declaring the French were beasts in Germany. I mean, they became nationalists. And here is the big surprise. All of the parties were split, including the United States Socialist Party, on the war. But the leading party, the leading socialist party that opposed the war in the advanced capitalist societies was the United States Party.
So what?
Deb's
The U.S. party.
The Social Democrats, who really had controlled the Social Democrats in the modern sense, who had controlled the party literally since 1900 and used the Debs as their banner socialist, although he was a revolutionary socialist. They emerged from the war as a minority section of the Socialist Party. Now here is the paradox, tragedy, you name it, but the party, the American Socialist Party, in a sense, agrees with Woodrow Wilson and the Democratic Party without attributing its agreement at all. The United States should keep its ass out of the war. You know, Wilson was against going into war as late as 1917. Yeah. But when the war started, the socialists, the center of the gradualist socialists, who still controlled the party, also supported the U.S. entrance into the war. So during that 1 year, 2 year period when the United States was involved in the war, 1916 was not counted. I'm not counting. It's really 17 and 18. The anti-war group was the majority, and so much of the majority that in the face of the Bolshevik Revolution, which was the origin of the Communist Party, a large section of the Socialist Party split and held its first convention as two conventions in 1919. Anybody any idea what those conventions were about? Are you sure? Oh, you know, this is another David. There was an organization called the Communist Party of the United States, and then there was another organization called the Communist Labor Party. The Communist Party of the United States was extremely orthodox and was primarily led by, but not exclusively, immigrants or people of recent immigrant origins. The aim of the Communist Labor Party was to constitute itself on the basis of American-born members. And it had a leader who had a famous name. His name was John Reed. John Reed was a journalist. Has anybody read John Reed today? I read John Reed at the age of 14 under the title 10 Days That Shook the World. It was his account of the Russian Revolution.
After which Lennon said, "Read this book."
Yes.
Just said, "Read this book." That's all he
Yeah,
said. That's great.
But what was interesting is that as far as the letter of Bolshevism, the Communist Party of the United States was much more religious than the Communist Party USA. John Reed was in many ways an innovative figure, and you can only get a glimpse of it in the Warren Beatty film,
Reds.
huh?
Reds.
What?
That's the name of the film, was Reds.
Reds.
Rent?
Reds. R-E-D-S?
Yeah, Reds.
No.
Commie Reds. Commie Reds.
Yeah.
The color red.
That's right.
Yeah, Reds.
Red.
Reds.
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 R-E-D-S.
Yeah.
And when he goes around and says you can't mechanically transpose what works in one context to our context, you have to have an American approach to the revolution. They merge in the 20s. And the Communist Party USA more or less controls the party, in part because they are not primarily mediators, but are primarily theoreticians whose grasp of mass politics is fragile, to say the least. But they do have theory, and the theory is a theory that's quite orthodox in the outside of the leap to socialism or communism. They would have a more or less long period of strikes, of organizing strikes, and winning seats to the Congress and to state legislatures and to city councils. But they would not only proclaim themselves communists, but they would constitute a series of educational institutions, city by city by major city, which trained generations into communism in the 20s. That part was largely adopted by the communists in Western Europe. And the communists in Western Europe who were for revolutionary mass action ultimately left the party, leaving, not immigrants so much, although some of them were, but leaving the gradualists in control with the appropriate revolutionary rhetoric. We don't know today, I mean you don't know today, the names of the major figures in the Communist Party of France. Anybody?
George Marchais.
Well, George Marchais is a pimple on the ass of the party. They're already in the process of disillusion.
Yeah.
I'm talking about in their
heyday.
their heyday.
The West Georgians are called.
who are some of the major names you would know?
Not many.
Well, not many. We don't read very much of of that period, but we did at one time. I say we radicals read French novels.
A lot of intellectuals were members of the party up until a
Yeah,
certain period, too.
But one of the major intellectuals who was also a major novelist who was a member of the party was Louis Aragon,
His own daddy.
who wrote novel after novel after novel.
Unrepentant Stalin.
After his famous novels in the 20s, he got worse and worse and worse.
Yeah. Unrepentant Stalin.
But still, he was Aragon. Many of the major intellectuals of the period were members of the party. Some of the leading organizational figures are also unknown today. The leader was Maurice Thorez, Thorez, until pretty much in the late 40s. And the Italian party, under some guy named Gramsci, you may have heard of him, was essentially in that populist vein. He fought battle in the Italian left with a very formidable figure who was the leader of the party until 1924.
Yes, okay.
And he was
The
in the- he was in
The
left-
East Georgian Mafia is
What?
calling you. The taxi is
What are you
here.
saying?
The East Georgian Mafia is calling you. The taxi is here.
Well,
That's
his,
not about
his
the
name,
I understand. It's a kind word in my vocabulary. It's highly organized.
only in underground publications will you find translations into French and English of Torres's opposition and Stalin's virtual opposition. He was the leader of the party. No names? Nobody, huh? Because you don't get exposed to him. As a matter of fact, I just did something which many leftists would regard as pure heresy, and they're not necessarily of the traditional Orthodox tradition. His name is Bordiga. Amitai Bordiga, who was the leader of the party and of the left-wing socialists from the war to about 1924. Now, Gramsci was a journalist and gradually became a member of the Central Committee of the Communist Party when it was constituted in the 1919-1920 period. But his voice was a voice of coalition, not the voice of the proletarian revolution in its pure form. Bordiga was a proletarian revolutionist, which Lukács begins to describe in the last chapter. And that proletarian revolutionist line pervades the artists. You've heard, I hope, an artist, a composer whose name was Hans Eisler. Hans Eisler wrote one of the most important anthems of the German Communist Party. And just because he's a worker, a man don't want a pistol to his head. He wants no worker under him and no boss over his head. She knows it. So left 2, 3, so left 2, 3. Do the work that we must do. March on in the Workers' United Front. You are a worker too. Or the other version
You're
of
not
this.
clinically demented, you proved it.
Now, I have to say this in addition. Eisler was the major student who Arnold Schoenberg, who Theodore Adorno was the greatest thought was the greatest composer of the 20th century. Eisler was Schoenberg's major student, and his earlier works, his works of the 1920s as a student of Schoenberg, sound like essentially post-modern music, right? And they're great. The stuff is very good. But then he gets converted to the party. But what he's converted to is Bordiga, not Gramsci, because Gramsci is hardly well known at that time. Gramsci is not in prison until 26, and his stuff doesn't come out until after 1937. But there's a whole group like Eisler whose brother created a famous anti-communist affair in the United States and was charged with being a spy, Gerhard Eisler. I have no doubt that Gerhard Eisler was a spy. No, Gerhard Eisler made a deal to get out of the United States without prosecution. He did not take the position of Hollywood 10, and especially its resident intellectual, one of its residents intellectual, John Howard Losman, which was fuck you, Lawson. He was a screenwriter and a playwright. Lawson said, we've always fought for the liberation of the working class. But did not talk about the United Front in the way in which Gramsci talks about it, or the Communist Party of 1935 through the 1950s talked of the United Front. The United Front was advanced by Lenin in 1922. 1922 thought that the revolutionary phase was decisively over, and talked about the United Front. The United Front was to be, for Lenin, which he would agree with, by the way, the unified movement of the socialist, unified form of the socialist movement, social democratic and communist alike, against fascism.
Okay, I got it.
Because by this time, Benito Mussolini was in power. And it was, although it was only in Italy, which was considered a relatively backward country, Lenin saw fascism as the main enemy of the left. The U.S. Communist Party, however, changed that meaning, as did the French Communist Party, and the German Communist Party was a little behind. They were a little more bodegaist. But they weren't expelled from the Communist International. It now became the Popular Front in the United States, but not until the 1930s, not until 1935. I'll explain that in a minute. And this is relevant to this book. The line was, after Lenin, that there were anti-fascist forces who were not necessarily leftists, not necessarily socialists at all. Some of them were bourgeois, some of them were bourgeois intellectuals, some of them were teachers, and so, yeah.
Katie's got to go because she's got
What'd
an
you say?
appointment. Katie's got an appointment.
Is it 2 o'clock?
It's after, it's 2:20.
2:20.
2:20. See, you've clinically
Oh, you have the point.
not proved anything about
Time is relative. It's all
Dimension-
relative.
Completely relative to time.
It's relative.
It's time and place, Stanley, not time and space.
Space down.
Katie.
Yeah.
Delirium.
I know where she is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was great.
Katie.